Hello everyone, this is Richard, and in this video I'll be teaching you some basic logic. But first let me give you a definition of the word. Logic is the art of using reason well in our inquiries after truth. This was the definition given by Isaac Watts, an 18th century English logician. It's good to study logic because it'll help you think better, reason better, speak better, and write better. And these are skills that everyone should try to improve. So the first word we need to learn is the word proposition. What is a proposition? A proposition is any sentence that signifies either truth or falsehood. The easiest way to understand this is to give you some examples. So first example, Plato was a philosopher. This sentence can be true or false. Therefore, it is a proposition. And in this case, it is a true proposition. Second example, Michael Jordan was a professional ping pong player. This sentence can be true or false. Therefore, it is a proposition. But in this case, it is a false proposition. Michael Jordan was obviously not a professional ping pong player, but a professional basketball player. It's important to note that commands are not propositions because they cannot be true or false. For example, the statement, or I should say the command, do your homework, is not a proposition because it cannot be true or false. You can either obey the command or disobey it, but you cannot call it true or false. Likewise, questions are not propositions because they cannot be true or false. If I ask you, are you hungry? That question cannot be true or false. The answer you give can be true or false. For example, you could say, yes, I am hungry, but the question itself cannot be true or false. Now, the next word we need to discuss is the word argument. What is an argument? An argument consists of two propositions, the premise and the conclusion. What is a premise? A premise is a proposition that is used to prove the truth of another proposition. What is a conclusion? A conclusion is a proposition that logically follows from another proposition. The premise is the foundation of the conclusion. The conclusion depends on the premise, and it logically follows from the premise. And an argument can have multiple premises that all try to prove the conclusion. Here is an example of an argument. It is an argument by one of the most famous philosophers, Rene Descartes, a 17th century French philosopher. Descartes wrote, I think, therefore I exist. So in this argument, the premise is I think, the conclusion is I exist. So what Descartes is saying is this: the fact that you think proves that you must exist. If you think, it necessarily follows that you exist. It would be logically absurd to say, I think, therefore I do not exist. Now here is a fuller definition of an argument. An argument is a group of propositions in which the conclusion logically follows from the premise or premises. The premise is the proposition that provides the support or grounds for the truth of the conclusion. The conclusion is the proposition you are trying to prove. In an argument, the premise should be the proposition that is more certain or sure. You don't want to base an argument on a premise that is uncertain or shaky. Just as a side note, instead of using the word therefore, you can also use the word because. For example, the statement, I drank coffee, therefore I cannot fall asleep, means the same thing as I cannot fall asleep because I drank coffee. You just need to invert the order. The word therefore comes before the conclusion. The word because comes before the premise. Now, if you want to refute your opponent's argument, you have two options. Option one, prove that the premise is false. For example, let's say your opponent says, Canada has a population of 500 million people. Therefore, Canada has a greater population than the US. So here the premise is, Canada has a population of 500 million people. The conclusion is, Canada has a greater population than the US. To refute this argument, you just need to prove that the premise is false. If you do a quick Google search, you will find that Canada only has a population of 40 million, while the US has a population of 340 million. This fact proves that the premise is false, and by extension, it refutes the argument. So that's option one. Here is option two. Prove that the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. For example, let's say your opponent says, it rained 6 hours ago, Therefore, the ground must be wet now. The premise is, it rained 6 hours ago. The conclusion is, the ground must be wet now. To refute this argument, you just need to demonstrate that the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. You can refute this by saying, we all know that it is possible that the ground dried up during the last 6 hours because of the heat from the sun. And if it did, the ground would no longer be wet. The conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. Therefore, the argument is not valid. So this is the second way of refuting an argument. There is a Latin word for this kind of refutation. It's called non sequitur, which means it does not follow, or the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. This is a nice Latin phrase you should memorize for your future debates. One final note. You should not automatically assume that someone is making true statements just because he's an authority figure in a certain field. For example, like a scientist or philosopher. Yes, you should respect what he has to say because he has done a lot of study in his field. However, you should always try to verify what he says by doing your own research, reading, and reflection. This is the first step to becoming a good thinker. So this is the end of my video. Hopefully you found it helpful, and I will talk to you next time.